All right, it's late. This has failed twice already. I'm getting this out come hell or high water. Quietus is a role playing game of melancholy horror by Ollie Jeffrey. Pronouns he, him, as far as I know. It came out in 2019, and if any of that information is updated since, sorry, I wasn't trying to be a jerk. But there's always a comfort problem when researching the pronouns or name of a developer who hasn't touched a project in a while. Always feels vaguely like I'm sniffing through someone's garbage. Anyway, let's talk about first impressions. Quietus is a really visually appealing book. I don't want to show you many pages from inside it because at this point I would just be showing you the rules, which are integrated around the artwork. I talk a lot about editing and presentation in TTRPGs, and I hope it's clear that the kind of thing I care about a lot because it's part of making games better. How people engage with your game is part of the interface for your game, and the part of the interface of the game is how people get to play it. I've praised games like Hardwired Island and Blades in the Dark for excellent editing and conveyance, and I have pointed to games like Rod, Reel, and Fist for when they mess up expressing themselves to players. Quietus is one of the good ones, even an example of aesthetically what I think is an excellent use of visual space to convey its information. There isn't a lot of art, but what is there is used and deployed well. Things are positioned so as to relate to the text that flows around them, and headers and footers are broken up with large banner images. The book credits Forged in the Dark as a foundational influence, which means it has DNA in common with Powered by the Apocalypse, which is a whole thorny bush of games that go over there. Now, I'm describing elements of this book in order because I think it's important to know that I'm not skipping anything with this description. You have a cover, you have a standard publisher information page, you have acknowledgements, you have a table of contents, and then this tabletop role-playing game slams on the brakes and produces a 6-page essay on horror movies, on how they convey horror, and a fairly in-depth history of horror movies. It's not a bad essay, I did enjoy it, and it told me about movies I knew and movies I didn't know. On the other hand, as far as first impressions of a game goes, it seems terrible. It has the hallmarks of a fish knife game, something that's so indie that it doesn't really consider how it looks to people who aren't already heavily invested in it. I made fun of the Exalted games for having 10 pages of in-universe comics and fiction before getting players oriented into the world. This, by comparison, is wild. It's almost hubristic. It's an I dare you to stop reading kind of approach, that in this 98-page book, the first thing any player is getting out of the gates is homework. Hell of a first impression. After that, though, we get into the game itself, with fiction bumpers to break up the flow of each section. The game mechanics section is solid. The mechanics as expressed work, they have clear interactions with player behavior, and they describe how they should be used. These things may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how often games kind of trail off describing when to use them and how. This is a game that works on essentially competing resource buildup. Players have a set of statistics, most of which they want to keep low, one they want to go up. The GM has one statistic, which will go down because they're spending it, trying to make those other 3 go up. It's a contrasting set of tensions, which is only slightly askew to the idea of the incentives of the GM. Because, the GM is there to run the story. It's an interesting puzzle, and I don't know if this game actually solves it. While we're here, there's also touchstones, a common thing in tabletop RPGs to present people with a bunch of stuff that you used as inspiration when you were making the game and you think inform the playing of the game. Now, about the touchstones. Do you remember that essay? The media touchstones in the game structure section are not the movies mentioned in the essay. The essay mentions a bunch of other movies, which is such a fascinating choice, because either you didn't mention them here because you already mentioned them there, or you don't mention them here because they're only important to the film history of horror, not to actually the game you spent money on. And don't worry, later on in the example section for the GM, there's going to be more movies mentioned, and they aren't these touchstones either. The game uses standard 6-sided die, and I think that that's really good. I appreciate a game system that's designed to be usable with just what you've nicked out of the Monopoly box. The more specific and unique a dice a game needs, the more of a fish knife it becomes. When you have to go out and buy something specific to play a game, you've probably got a problem. It is a player's role only kind of game. The GM doesn't have to pick up dice. This is one of those Blades in the Dark mechanics that I've come to really appreciate. Fundamentally, this is a game that is emphasizing collaborative storytelling, which is really good. I like collaborative storytelling. I am, however, going to say some things about why I don't like this game, and I really want to make it clear that that's not the same thing as this game being bad. In this game, both the player and the GM are trying to spin fiction together. The creative effort is shared between them, and I like that. I think that's really good. However, I think the skill that is easiest to bring to bear in Quietus isn't role-playing, as in being able to inhabit a space that reacts to you, imagining yourself as a character relating to the universe happening around you and ensouling that experience, but rather, instead, this is a game for two writers, where one of them wants to have a bad time and the other one wants to inflict a bad time. It feels less like a TTRPG to me than it feels like a journaling game where you don't write anything down for some reason. The narrative tools and the GM stuff in the book mentions encouraging you to ask questions, and I think that's really good too. In fact, I wish it was developed even more. The game describes that you should be listening and always prepared to ask questions, which is a place it would be great to have a little pop-out sidebar presenting examples of those kind of questions that would facilitate the movement of a scene. I know that good players and writers won't need that kind of list, but I think that part of making your game approachable is remembering that you will always have a least confident player doing this for the first time. The GM's role is kind of an officiation of the exchange with the fiction. The player can do things to put themselves in a precarious position, but the GM is the one with the power to make things get worse. The player is the one who can fail to make things get better. These strike me as story boundaries that a good pair of writers are going to just ignore regularly. Oh, it'll get done in the most pass-the-parcel kind of way, where a GM will stumble on imagining the best way to proceed the story, and the player will, because they're already thinking of this in terms of being a good writer, inspired by the tension, suggest something very good. And then the GM will go, ooh, I do that then. The emotional scores that drive the game are anxiety, hope, despair, and dread. They all start at 0, and they increase throughout the course of the game, depending upon the stimulus you get. Again, I think this is a really well-chosen set of game terms because 3 of those things feel similar and have overlap, but by having them presented as your distinct game options and wanting to keep things from getting worse, you're presented with a player wanting to think really hard about ways to spread out their emotional reactions to something. It also means that you're bringing a predetermined set of lenses to consider every scenario. This is good game language. You can anxiety someone to death, just like in real life, and the scores are transactional. Paying into one gets you something out of the other. The GM's goal is to inflict bad things, and they get the stat dread, which is where all that transaction happens, which they can use to make bad things happen to the player. One of my favorite mechanics here is that if the player duffs a roll and you're the GM and you can't think of what would go wrong there, you just get a dread point and you can save that to really put the screws to them later. All right, now elegantly re-find your place. The GM's goal is to inflict bad things, and they get the stat dread, which they can use to make bad things happen. One of my favorite mechanics here is that if the player duffs a roll and you can't think of what would go wrong there, you just get a dread point and you can save that to really put the screws to them later. Of course, this is a potential problem because it requires the GM to be really active about managing that resource and spending it in situations that don't feel horribly unfair. You've got to aggressively keep your dread score down. No big stockpile. If you get to the end of a story and the GM has like 6 dread points sitting around, there's no good way to work with that. You're either really screwed because they can just dread a bunch of your rolls, or they don't, in which case you didn't win because you told a better story or because the dice favored you. You won because the villain was stockpiling elixirs. The GM pulled their punches. There is a section on safety tools. It's 4 pages long, and I think that's a great thing, again, especially for a horror game. Centering consent and boundaries in conversations around horror, a transgressive media form about emotional turmoil and pain, is just sensible and ethical game design. Now, to be a little mean, I do think that the safety tools probably could have come before the essay on movies, but I also think other things could have been before that essay about movies. The GM section emphasizes the improvisational narrative, which is where the game lays out very hard that this isn't a game system for anyone who has an actual horror campaign in mind. It's not a planned out narrative. You have to instead respond to what the player or players brought and your own experiences with the kinds of fiction you probably think about a lot. This makes a library of fictional references more useful, which is a good thing. This is probably a really fun challenge, but it is a place where the game system is doing the opposite of what I think a good game system does, which is offloading effort so the people playing the game don't have to come up with everything themselves. That the game doesn't give the GM tools to create, but instead indicates the spaces they should be creating in, is not a bad thing per se, but it does, again, communicate a lot about who this game is for. It also presumes that the player and the GMs have done the readings of hundreds of hours of prestige horror cinema. There's a type of player for whom this game has zero research required because you've already done this, in which case you can just judge this game based on its merits, and I think it's probably really good at that. Meet it where it wants to be and don't ask it to help you where it can't, and I bet you'll have a wonderfully horrible time. Again though, this is an example of something that feels like it doesn't know new players exist. It's user hostile in a way that is rare to even see existing, as if the essay in the beginning wasn't just straight up precedent. Now this is where you think, I'm about to bollock this game for being a fish knife. But I'm not. It is okay for a game to be a prestige product, and in the context of the $1 and $2 itch.io RPG space games that are all about one or two scenes and maybe half an idea, this is what this is. It is okay for a very singular experience to be elevated. It is okay for a game system to only be useful for a very specific time and place, and this is a game that delivers on that with a price tag of $10. This game is absolutely a $10 experience in the same way that a movie ticket or a non-typical food order would be. It's okay for this to be not for everyone, and I think that the book itself communicates clearly who it's for. It is haute cuisine of tabletop RPG design, a specific thing for a discerning, limited clientele. It doesn't offer much that I want, that a Blades in the Dark or a Powered by the Apocalypse game doesn't already offer. But then again, I play Dungeons and Dragons. That's to damn with faint praise, which I feel is inadequate because those are games that have sprawled over everything. How about this? This is a small specific experience. This is a glass of whiskey in a world of beer. For me, I associate horror TTRPGs with groups of people, and one-shot TTRPGs with parties. So for this felt about when I approached it, oh look, a horror TTRPG. That'll fit well around Halloween. What I found doesn't really work for that. This isn't something you can do at a party where everyone's hanging out. This is something to sit down with one person and have a good old intense, terrifying time. And I don't know, maybe you should be journaling it.